December 1944, New Jersey. German women POWs were trembling on American soil. As Luftwaffe auxiliaries, they braced for the worst. They expected hatred. They received hot coffee from U.S. Army MPs. American rules, dictated by the Geneva Convention, promised respect instead of cruelty. But this mercy held a truth they were not prepared for. It was a kindness that felt more dangerous than hatred. What happens when an enemy's decency becomes a more terrifying prison than the camp itself? Tell us where you're watching from and the time there. We want to know how far these testimonies travel. If dignity and hidden truths matter to you, please subscribe to keep these stories alive. In the cold grey light of a December morning in 1944, the ship's engine finally went quiet. For weeks, the deep churning rhythm had been the only constant in a world of water and sky. Now, there was only the sound of waves against the hull and the cries of gulls. On deck, a small group of German women stood huddled in their long Luftwaffe auxiliary coats, the wool thin against the biting Atlantic wind. They were exhausted. 23-year-old Ilse K., a radio operator captured in France, felt the wooden deck tremble beneath her feet, or perhaps it was her own knees. Before them, through the haze, was the shoreline of New Jersey. This was American soil. Every story they had been told, every whispered warning from their officers, had prepared them for this moment. Propaganda had painted a clear and terrible picture. In America, they were told, female prisoners would be spat on, starved, paraded in the streets as trophies of war. Humiliation was the best they could hope for. The worst was not spoken of, but it lived in the back of every woman's mind. Capture was a shame worse than death, and this was the place where that shame would be made real. As the ramp lowered onto the dock, Ilse braced herself, her jaw tight. She watched the American soldiers approach, their faces unreadable beneath their helmets. These were the military police, the MPs, the enemy her leaders had described as brutes. There was no shouting, no shoving. One by one, the women walked down the ramp, their legs unsteady on solid ground. An American soldier, a man no older than Ilse herself, stood with a tray of enamel mugs. He offered one to her. She flinched, expecting it to be a trick, a prelude to a blow. But he only waited, his expression calm. Hesitantly, she took the mug. The heat from it was a shock, spreading through her frozen fingers. She lifted it to her cracked lips and inhaled the steam. It was coffee, strong and hot. The smell of it mingled with the salt of the sea air. All around her, other women were accepting the same small offering, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Another group of MPs began to gather their suitcases, carrying the worn luggage for them as if they were guests, not prisoners. This small act of courtesy was so profoundly wrong, so contrary to every warning, that it felt like a dislocation from reality. Ilse glanced at another woman, a nurse named Agnes, and saw her own bewilderment reflected in her eyes. A thought began to form in Ilse's mind, sharp and dangerous. Everything they were told could not be true. This simple, humane reception was not an accident. It was American policy. By late 1944, the United States held more than 370,000 German prisoners of war. They were scattered across the country in hundreds of camps, from the plains of Texas to the farmlands of Minnesota. Only a tiny fraction of these prisoners, fewer than 1%, were women. Most, like Ilse, were auxiliaries captured in Italy and France, while others were Red Cross nurses. In 1943, the U.S. War Department had codified its rules for handling all prisoners, strictly following the obligations of the Geneva Convention. These rules were clear. Prisoners of war were to receive the same quality of food, shelter, and medical care as American troops. For the men and women who had spent the last years on dwindling rations in a collapsing Germany, this policy would lead to an existence they could never have imagined. They were the enemy, and yet they would be treated with a measure of dignity that felt utterly foreign. They had prepared their souls for cruelty, for a final, bitter humiliation at the hands of their conquerors. They had steeled themselves to endure hatred and degradation as the price of defeat. But no one had prepared them for this. No one had prepared them for kindness. The trembling in Ilse's legs did not stop as she drank the coffee. The fear was still there, but it was changing. It was no longer the simple fear of a captive facing her enemy. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, the fear of a world turned upside down, where the lines between friend and foe, truth and lie, had suddenly begun to dissolve. From the docks, The women were taken by train, the American landscape, a blur of snow-covered fields and distant farmhouses outside the windows. Their final destination was a camp in Iowa, a place surrounded by a vast, silent emptiness they had never known. The first morning inside the wire, they were ordered to line up for inspection. Standing in the bitter cold, their breath turning to mist, they waited stiffly, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead. This, they thought, is where the real treatment begins. They expected jeers, insults, a thorough and demeaning search of their few belongings. Instead, a man approached, an American officer whose insignia marked him as the camp commandant. He was Captain Robert Myers, a quiet man with weary eyes. He walked the line slowly, his gaze professional and distant. He stopped before them and spoke, his voice clear and even in the frigid air. "You are soldiers. You will be treated as such." The words landed with a strange weight, not friends, not guests, but soldiers. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of rules, but in that moment it felt like a shield. It conferred a status, a strange and unexpected form of respect that stripped away the vulnerability they had felt since their capture. That respect was echoed in the mess hall. They were led inside to long wooden tables and handed metal trays. They expected watery soup, a crust of hard bread. What they saw made them stop in their tracks. There were scrambled eggs, slices of white bread with butter, and for every woman, a glass of milk. It was a feast. Ilse looked at her tray, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't seen a real egg in years. The women ate in near silence, the only sounds the scraping of forks and quiet, incredulous murmurs. One prisoner, a young woman who had served in Italy, later found a small scrap of cloth and a piece of charcoal. In neat, careful letters, she wrote a sentence she would hide for the rest of the war. "I ate more here in 1 week than in 6 months at home." This was not a place of punishment, it was a place of impossible abundance. The camps themselves were designed for order, not suffering. Modeled after standard US Army bases, they consisted of simple wooden barracks with rows of bunks, a recreation hall, and even small libraries. The books were a strange mix: American novels, English-language primers, and works by German authors like Goethe, a quiet acknowledgement of their culture. Though German male prisoners in the US outnumbered women by more than 50 to 1, the women were kept in their own segregated compounds. The War Department had issued strict non-fraternization policies, fearing scandals. Yet inside the wire, official rules and human impulse often diverged in small, meaningful ways. One afternoon, during laundry detail, Ilse stood over a tub of hot water, scrubbing her uniform with a harsh bar of soap. Her knuckles were raw from the cold, but the work was a comfort. To be clean, to wear clothes that did not carry the stench of defeat, was a small victory. A young guard, Sergeant Harold Dixon, a quiet man from Texas, walked by. Without a word, he placed a second, larger bar of soap on the edge of the washtub and kept walking. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it broke something inside her. The warmth of the water, the clean scent of the soap, the unexpected offering of a little extra. It was too much. Ilse leaned against the tub, the rough wool of her uniform soaked through, and quietly began to cry. The tears were not for her captivity, but for this simple, fragile feeling of being human again. Other small mercies chipped away at the propaganda they had been fed. Sergeant Dixon would sometimes use a piece of chalk to write simple English words on a board, patiently sounding them out for the curious women. In return, a few of the prisoners taught him how to say phrases in German. On other days, cigarettes might be quietly traded for a piece of intricate embroidery, a secret economy of kindness. The camp nurse, Agnes Weber, once approached Captain Myers about a fellow prisoner whose hands were badly frostbitten. In some Axis camps, withholding medical supplies from captives was common practice. Here, Agnes was given a generous supply of clean bandages and ointment, no questions asked. But this strange sanctuary could not keep the outside world at bay forever. By the spring of 1945, letters from home began to arrive. They were heavily censored, with black ink blotting out entire paragraphs, but fragments of the truth slipped through. They told of cities turned to rubble, of families scattered and lost. The name Dresden was whispered like a prayer and a curse. One day, a letter arrived for Ilse. It was from an aunt in a distant village. The words were few, the black marks of the censor heavy. Her street in Hamburg no longer existed. Her home was gone. Her parents, her brother, their fate was unknown. That night in the mess hall, Ilse stared at the full tray of food before her. The bread, the meat, the milk, the nourishment that had seemed like a miracle now felt like a poison. The kindness of her captors had become an unbearable weight. A single, terrible thought consumed her. I am eating in safety while my mother starves. The news of Germany's final surrender in May 1945 arrived not with a bang, but as a quiet, official announcement from Captain Myers. For the women in the Iowa camp, the war was over, but their captivity was not. The end of the fighting did not bring relief, only a profound and unsettling stillness. They were suspended between a past that was now in ashes and a future that was a complete unknown. The good food, the clean barracks, the small, consistent kindnesses from the guards, these things, once a source of shocking comfort, now felt like part of a strange dream they were afraid they would be punished for. The guilt Ilse felt had spread through the barracks like a low-grade fever, leaving the women weary and suspicious. They were safe, they were fed, and for that, they began to feel an inexplicable sense of shame. It was a prison built not of wire and wood, but of a kindness they could not reconcile with the ruin of their homeland. Later that summer, a representative from the International Red Cross arrived to inspect the camp, a standard procedure to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention. The women were gathered in the recreation hall. The representative, a neutral Swiss man with a polite, tired face, asked them to speak freely. He walked among them, his notebook in hand, and asked the required question, "Are you being mistreated?" A heavy silence filled the room. The women looked at the floor, at their hands, anywhere but at him. They had been mistreated their entire lives, by hunger, by war, by their own government's promises. But here, the answer was not simple. Finally, a woman near the back, a quiet medic from a Luftwaffe hospital unit, hesitated and then spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "No, we are treated too well." The words hung in the air, dangerous and true. It was an admission that felt like a betrayal. To admit to good treatment was to invalidate the suffering of their families back home. It was to say that the enemy was not a monster, that the entire foundation of their world, built on hatred and fear of the other, was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else was? That quiet confession cracked open the fragile unity among the prisoners. In the evenings, after the lights were out, the barracks became a space of whispered arguments. A few of the women, fiercely loyal to the ideology they had been raised on, insisted the kindness was a trick. They saw the extra soap, the English lessons, the medical care, as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, a trick to break their spirit and turn them against the fatherland. They called the women who accepted these kindnesses weak, even traitors. But others, like the nurse Agnes, argued for the simple truth. They were soldiers, she would say, and the Americans were following the rules for soldiers. There was no trick, only a code of conduct they themselves had been taught to respect. Ilse listened to both sides, torn. Her heart knew the small kindnesses were genuine. She had seen the tired sincerity in Sergeant Dixon's eyes, but her mind understood the danger. When they finally went home, who would believe them? They would be returning not as heroes who had endured, but as collaborators who had been comfortable. This growing fear of repatriation became a new kind of dread. The war had ended, and soon they would be sent back to Germany. But they would not be returning to the country they had left. They would be returning to whispers, to suspicion, to a people who would demand stories of horror and would not accept tales of humane treatment. As 1945 drew to a close, a fragile peace settled over the camp for a single night. It was Christmas Eve. The guards, led by Captain Myers, had allowed the women to hold a small concert. One of the prisoners had a harmonica, and its thin, reedy notes filled the cold air of the recreation hall. The women began to sing, their voices soft at first, then growing stronger. They sang a lullaby, a song of home, of childhood, of a world that no longer existed. Their voices trembled, not with fear, but with a mixture of profound homesickness and a deep, unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in over a year, Ilse heard genuine laughter ripple through the room. It was a sound so foreign, so fragile, it felt like it could break. But for that one night, they were not prisoners, and their guards were not the enemy. They were just people, far from home, caught in the quiet aftermath of a storm. Weeks later, as the camp prepared for repatriation in early 1946, Ilse sat on her bunk with the small, cloth-bound journal they had been given. She wrote down the date, her hand steady. She thought of the coffee on the docks, the eggs on her first morning, the sound of the harmonica. Then, she wrote the sentence that had been haunting her for months. I fear to speak of the kindness. They will say I betrayed the fatherland. The mercy she had been shown had become her secret, a truth that now felt as heavy and as dangerous as any weapon. The journey home in the spring of 1946 was the reverse of the one that had brought them to America. The ship moved not from a world of ruin toward one of order, but the other way around. As they sailed east, the women were quiet, a different kind of anxiety settling upon them. They were no longer afraid of their enemies. They were afraid of their own people. The ship finally docked at the port of Bremerhaven, a city of skeletal buildings and rubble-strewn streets. The air tasted of coal smoke and damp rot. On the dock below, a small, somber crowd had gathered. These were not cheering families, but strangers with hollow eyes, waiting to claim relatives they had not seen in years. There were no parades, no welcome home banners, only a profound and heavy silence. As Ilse and the other women walked down the gangplank, they were met not with embraces, but with searching, suspicious stares. Their clothes were too whole, their faces not thin enough. They did not look like survivors of an enemy prison camp. They looked healthy, and in that hungry, broken city, health was an accusation. Ilse understood immediately. The stories her countrymen needed to hear were stories of American brutality, of suffering and resistance. Such stories would help make sense of their own immense losses, justify the sacrifices, and reaffirm that their cause, even in defeat, had been righteous. The women carried the wrong stories. They carried memories of warm coffee, of clean soap, of full meals, and quiet respect. To speak of this was not just unbelievable, it was a deep and unforgivable betrayal of the shared German suffering. The mercy they had received in America was a truth that had no place here, and so it became a secret. For decades that followed, most of the women who had been prisoners in America buried their experience. When asked about the war, they would speak of the fighting in France, of their capture, and then fall silent on the years that followed. It was a blank space in their history, an island of memory they could never share. They hid their English primers, their small embroidered cloths, and the bewildering shame of having been treated with dignity by the enemy. Decades passed. The world changed. Germany was rebuilt. Ilse K. married, raised a family, and grew old. In 1983, she was a grandmother, living in a small, quiet apartment in a rebuilt Hamburg that bore no resemblance to the city of her youth. Her hands, now wrinkled with age, were often busy knitting for her grandchildren. One afternoon, her granddaughter, a curious girl of 10, sat beside her, looking through an old photo album. She pointed to a faded picture of Ilse in her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. "Were you scared in the war, Oma?" Ilse paused, her knitting needles still. She looked at the girl's innocent face and saw a generation that had never known a world of propaganda and hatred. And for the first time, she felt the urge to speak the simple, unvarnished truth. She thought back to that cold December morning in 1944, to the feeling of the ship's deck beneath her feet and the fear that had made her whole body tremble. "I trembled with fear on American soil," she said softly, "and was met with coffee. That is what I remember." The American commitment to the Geneva Convention during World War II was not perfect, but it stood in stark moral contrast to the conditions in Axis prison camps. By 1946, almost all of the 370,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States had been repatriated. The fewer than 1% who were women left behind a unique and complicated legacy. Their testimony cut deeper than that of the male prisoners, precisely because the propaganda had promised them not just death, but dishonor. They were the ones who were supposed to be paraded in shame, the ones who were supposed to validate the enemy's monstrousness. Instead, they had been treated as soldiers, their dignity guarded by the very people they were taught to despise. In the end, Ilse's memory of the war was not defined by the chaos of battle or the bitterness of defeat. It was held in that single, quiet moment on the New Jersey shoreline. The image never left her, her own 2 hands trembling, wrapped around a warm enamel mug. She had braced for hatred. What she found was dignity, and that small mercy reshaped her memory of the war forever.